The longships appeared without warning. Low in the water, dragon-headed prows cutting through morning mist, oars striking the sea in perfect rhythm. For the coastal villages of early medieval Europe, that sight meant one thing. The Vikings had come. Between the late 8th and 11th centuries, Norse raiders from Scandinavia reshaped Europe. From the monasteries of Northumbria to the river towns of Francia, from Ireland to the distant markets of the Abbasid Caliphate, their reach was astonishing. But behind every burned hall and fallen warband was another story rarely told: the fate of the women left behind. To understand what happened to them, we first need to understand Viking society itself. The people we call Vikings were primarily Norse from regions that are now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and sometimes raiders. Raiding was not random chaos. It was strategic. Coastal settlements were targeted for wealth, livestock, and captives. Captives were not incidental. They were central. Because in the Viking world, human beings could be property. They were called thralls. A thrall was an enslaved person, someone captured in war, born into slavery, or sold through trade. Slavery was not unique to the Norse. It existed across Europe and the Islamic world. But the Vikings became one of the most aggressive slave-trading cultures of their time. When a settlement fell and warriors were killed, women and children were often taken. Not as an act of random cruelty but as economic strategy. Strong young women were valuable. They could work farms, manage households, weave textiles, and in some cases be forced into concubinage. Skilled captives could command high prices in markets stretching from Dublin to Constantinople. The Irish annals describe entire communities carried off across the sea. In 821, Vikings are recorded taking a great prey of women from Ireland. In Anglo-Saxon England, similar accounts appear in monastic chronicles. But what did this mean in practical terms? It meant separation. Families shattered in a single afternoon. A woman whose husband had died defending his home might find herself bound for a ship within hours. The voyage across the North Sea could take days. Conditions were harsh. Food was limited. Disease spread easily. Upon arrival in Scandinavia, some captives were absorbed into rural farms. Others were resold in trade hubs like Hedeby or Birka. Still others were transported along the great river routes through Eastern Europe toward markets connected to the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were traders, and people were part of that trade. In places like Dublin, founded as a Viking settlement, slave markets became integral to the local economy. This was the harsh reality of early medieval warfare. Survival depended on labor, and labor could be taken. But the story is more complex than endless suffering. Some enslaved women eventually integrated into Norse society. Archaeological evidence suggests that not all thralls remained enslaved for life. Manumission, the granting of freedom, was possible though not guaranteed. In Icelandic sagas, we even see stories of enslaved women who rise in status through marriage or childbirth, though sagas mix history and legend. DNA studies in modern Iceland reveal that while much of the male ancestry traces to Scandinavia, a significant portion of female ancestry traces to the British Isles. This suggests that many women brought during Viking expansion became foundational ancestors of later generations. This does not erase the violence that brought them there. But it reminds us that history is not only destruction, it is also transformation. It is also important to understand that Viking women themselves were not powerless figures. Norse law codes show that free women in Scandinavia could own property, initiate divorce, and manage estates in their husband's absence. Some were wealthy landowners. The tragedy, then, is layered. Free women in raided lands lost autonomy and were forced into systems where status depended on survival and negotiation. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, free women maintained rights unusual for much of medieval Europe. The same culture that allowed relative independence for its own women participated in enslaving others. This contradiction sits at the heart of the Viking Age. Were all captured women treated the same? No. Status mattered. Beauty, skills, age, and health mattered. A noblewoman might be held for ransom. A craftswoman might be kept for her expertise. Others were sold quickly. Some captives likely formed relationships over time that were complex, shaped by coercion, adaptation, and shifting identity. We must be careful not to romanticize this. Modern portrayals sometimes blur the line between consensual union and forced captivity. But in most cases, these women had no choice in the beginning. And yet, over generations, cultures blended. Norse settlements in England evolved into the Danelaw. In Normandy, named after the Northmen, Viking descendants became French nobles. In Russia, Norse traders helped shape early state structures. The genetic and cultural imprint of captive women traveled with them. When we say the Vikings reshaped Europe, we are not only speaking of battles. We are speaking of households, of children born between conqueror and captive, of languages mixing at kitchen tables, of songs from Ireland sung in Icelandic halls. The wives of defeated warriors did not simply vanish from history. They became part of it. Still, we cannot ignore the trauma. For every story of integration, there were countless lives marked by loss. The psychological toll of enslavement is harder to trace than burned monasteries. Chroniclers rarely recorded the voices of the taken. Their names are mostly lost. What we have are fragments, law codes, trade records, skeletal remains showing geographic origins far from burial sites. Archaeology fills the silence. Graves in Scandinavia sometimes reveal women buried with Scandinavian goods but isotopic signatures from Britain or Ireland. They lived, worked, and died far from their birthplace. History often focuses on kings and war leaders, figures like Ragnar Lodbrok or Harald Fairhair, but the true demographic impact of the Viking Age lies in migration, forced and voluntary. So was it worse than death? For some, captivity may indeed have felt that way in the moment of loss. But history is rarely defined by a single emotional phrase. What happened was displacement, enslavement, cultural absorption, survival. The Viking Age was brutal, as most eras of expansion were. Yet from that brutality emerged new societies, new identities, and new lineages that still shape Europe today. The dragon ships eventually stopped coming. Christianity spread across Scandinavia. Slave trading declined. Kingdoms centralized. The Viking Age faded. But the legacy of those taken, especially the women, remains written not in sagas, but in DNA, in place names, and in the shared ancestry of millions. History is not only about who swung the sword. It is about who endured after the sword was lowered. And in the long shadow of the Viking Age, the endurance of those women is one of its most powerful and most human stories.